Okay, I think we're going to get started, just because we have a number of things to do and want to use everybody's time wisely. Thank you all so much for coming and for coming out for the first in this lecture series. I'm Sandy Zipp. I'm the director of the Urban Studies program here at Brown and professor of American Studies as well as Urban Studies. I'm going to say a few words, a couple things to introduce this because this is a sort of auspicious occasion. So I want to talk a little bit about why we're here before we talk with our guests. But it's quick, it's brief. So the program is taking stock this year, really. Today's event is the first in a series marking the anniversary of 50 years of urban studies at Brown. And we're taking this milestone as an opportunity to engage in a sort of year-long schedule of events in which we're going to be thinking about how we, as students, as teachers, as researchers, should be thinking about cities, urbanization, urbanist practice, and history in the here and now. Our first goal here, though, in keeping with the program's main mission as the convener of an undergraduate concentration, is to think together about what it means to become an urbanist today, what it means to be thinking or rethinking how to be an urbanist today. If you're just at the start of your career as an urbanist thinker, if you're here as part of an undergraduate class, or if you're sitting down with us today after many years of thinking about urbanist problems, but are forced by so many things that are going on today, as we'll talk about, that require us to think hard about how to think anew about cities and urbanization. So, how should students, all of us are students in this moment in some sense, be thinking about urbanization and cities for the future? So, urban studies was first established at Brown in 1971 in the form of a faculty committee charged with establishing new courses in urban studies to join those already existing in the departments of political science, sociology, economics, history, and engineering. The committee oversaw independent concentrations in urban studies. There were 10 in 1972, 20 in 1973, and then approved a standard concentration in 1973, and shortly thereafter it took the program form that we know it today. Over the years since, the program has added courses and faculty in anthropology and art and architecture, in American studies, in literature, in environment and society, education, and a number of other social science and humanities disciplines to its interdisciplinary curriculum. Urban Studies was founded, like many other similar programs at the time, at a moment when cities were seen as a source of a sort of special concern. Right, this was the era of the so-called urban crisis in the United States, in the late 60s and early 70s, in which cities were seen to be the source of so-called urban problems, right? Deindustrialization, poverty, segregation, racial strife, suburbanization. We still live with the long tail, so to speak, of all those issues. But for the last few decades, those older concerns were filtered through a different story, one of so-called urban resurgence and urban vibrancy. Both here in the US and across the global south and global north. Now, this threw up new kinds of problems: gentrification, housing informality, displacement, racialized policing, sprawl, many of which were themselves reformulations of those older problems. But they were all understood through the lens of the idea that cities were not themselves a source of those problems, or not just a source of those problems, but a source also of inspiration and hope for solutions to those issues. This was hopeful, and the effects of this way of thinking, I think, still linger. But today, I think we find ourselves at the beginning of perhaps a new kind of moment, a new conjuncture, it would seem, yet another time of urban thinking, when big cities in many ways have priced themselves out of success, and climate change and a global pandemic have thrown all the previous sureties up in the air. Those of you who are quite a bit younger than our guest Neil and I are, will know this quite intimately, thinking about how to live in cities these days with the combined challenges of inequality, the expensive nature of city life, especially around housing, and of course climate change, and what we've all been through in the last few years and are still going through. We're having to once again rethink the history and present of urbanism for a new time. And over the course of this year, we're going to have a number of guests from a number of different disciplines to help us push our thinking along. And I hope you'll join us in the coming months for conversations between Aiwa Ong and Lauren Yap, Robert Sampson and Josh Pashevitz, Tony Griffin and Rebecca Carter, Ananya Roy and Teo Wickland, and one mystery yet to be determined guest, and likely our colleague Jim Marone. And so today, though, we're going to kick off all these discussions with at the sort of biggest frame possible, in the largest way possible, both conceptually and spatially, because we're lucky today to have with us one of the most far-thinking urbanists writing in these times, and that's Neil Brenner. Neil is the Lucy Flower Professor of Urban Sociology, the Director of the Urban Theory Lab, and the Chair of the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization at the University of Chicago. Among his many books and other writings are New Urban Spaces, Urban Theory and the Scale Question from 2019, and New State Spaces, Urban Governance and the Rescaling of Statehood from 2004, as well as perhaps most importantly for today's conversation, the edited volume Implosions/Explosions, Towards a Study of Planetary Urbanization, which came out in 2014. So, a word about the format. Neil and I will talk for 30 or 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions and conversation with the audience. There are so many of you today here from the undergraduate population at Brown, and I really hope that all of you will be warming up your questions, right? We'd like to take questions first from students, so think that over as you're listening and get your questions ready. We'd love to hear from you first. Neil's going to get us started with some opening remarks and a video. He'll tell you all about that, and then we'll have a conversation. So please join me in welcoming Neil Brenner to Brown.
So thank you all for being here. Thank you to my good friend Sandy for inviting me. This is the first time I've done a public presentation outside my home university since, before times, without a mask even, at least up here. So I'm really happy just to have that experience again. It's great to be together. So this is going to be a conversation about urban studies and how it fits into the university, and also how it fits into struggles ongoing about urbanization, and ultimately what I really care about, the future of the Earth, the future of life on Earth. So where I think we want to go in this conversation is to think about cities, whatever we mean by cities, urbanization, whatever we mean by urbanization, we've got to unpack that, in the context of the Earth, the ongoing crises of life on Earth. So pretty high stakes. And one of the arguments that I'm going to make in dialogue with Sandy is that we actually, in order to understand the crises of the Earth related to climate change and biodiversity loss and so many other processes of environmental crisis, urbanization is a key piece of that puzzle. But in order to understand that connection, we actually have to rethink some of the inherited ways in which we've understood urbanization. So that's a proposition that we're going to kick around. And before we turn to the video, which I'll say a bit about in a moment, I just want to open by saying a little bit about theory. Because I've worked in this field for a while, in different departments, different disciplines. My PhD is in political science. I taught sociology for a while. I taught at Harvard Graduate School of Design for a while, teaching urban planning, and now I'm back in a sociology department where I collaborate with environmental historians and lots of anthropologists. It's very interdisciplinary. But what I'm really fundamentally committed to in my scholarship and also in my kind of critical work is critical theory. And there's a lot to be said about that, and I promised Sandy I'd be brief in my introduction, but it's actually pretty relevant to this conversation. So any approach to almost any aspect of social life, certainly in the field of urban studies, presupposes underlying theoretical assumptions, underlying concepts, underlying assumptions about how processes that we're trying to study work, about history, about space, about society. And the work of theory in general, whether it's critical theory or not, is to interrogate those concepts, to test them out, to experiment with them, to see whether they help, to see whether they obfuscate whatever it is that we're trying to understand. So in all the teaching that I do and all the research that I do, one of the starting points, and really in a certain way the end point as well, is to try to get clear about the underlying theoretical assumptions that we're making about the concepts and the processes. And that's just essential. And it turns out that by critically interrogating your concepts, you can actually do some pretty fundamental interpretive work, both in terms of understanding certain blind spots and missing links in inherited understandings of issues that you're trying to understand, but also opening up space for alternative understandings of what we care about. And that brings us to critical theory, which is not just theory, but critique. So critical theory, again, a lot can be said about it, but just to frame this a little bit further, critical theory is a project which entails, among other things, trying to reveal the power relations, the inequalities, the dispossessions, the social and political violence, sometimes the cultural violence, that inheres within socio-political processes. In order to reveal the inequalities and the power relations, you have to actually interrogate the framework of interpretation. So there's a fundamental connection, as Marx, as Foucault, as feminist theory, as queer theory have revealed in different ways, between knowledge and power. And that's a fundamental commitment of all the work that I do, and very relevant, I think, to this discussion. And then one other element of critical theory that I think is relevant, critical theory presupposes that the knower is always embedded within the very social processes they're trying to study. So there's no Archimedean point outside of the social world through which to develop a complete science or complete knowledge of social life, because we're part of the very same social world that we're trying to study. Once you embrace that assumption, you are committed to recognizing that you frequently need to reinvent your theoretical framework in relation to social change, but also in relation to social struggle. So critical theory in many ways is committed to the idea not only of revealing the kinds of power relations and so on that I just was talking about, but also interrogating the framework of analysis in pursuit of alternative understandings of the world that might also facilitate emancipation, and we might add, in this context of today's conversation, some sort of more environmentally sane way of organizing our collective existence. So that's all pretty high-level meta-theoretical commentary, but pretty relevant, actually, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about is whether the frameworks of analysis in urban studies and in other frameworks, also in environmental studies, that we've inherited from earlier generations of scholarship, critical and otherwise, are actually adequate to the challenges of our time. So as Sandy was just describing the context in which urban studies was founded at Brown about 50 years ago. And what I also want to really keep in mind in our conversation today is, what do we think, and I don't know the answer, I just think it's an important question, what might we need to do in our work today to develop an approach to urban studies that is adequate or at least helpful in relation to where the world might be 50 years from now? And I think that's a very challenging, both intellectually and politically kind of question. Okay, so full stop. Let me say a word about this video before I play it. So I collaborate with a number of friends and colleagues in the Urban Theory Lab, including Julia and Mike over here in the corner. And we, long story, contributed a project to the Venice Biennale for Architecture a couple years ago, which was meant to be an exhibition with a lot of materials in it, but because of the pandemic, we did a video animation. It was in a room in Venice, but we didn't want to encourage people to go to the Biennale because of the public health hazards associated with that, so it's readily available on Vimeo. But in the actual room, it was basically the size of probably this window. It was like a pretty big wall. And actually, fortunately, we have a pretty big screen. So it's an 8-minute video animation called Data Spheres of Planetary Urbanization, a concept that we're going to dive into here. And it's a pretty good, sorry, is this buzzing? Is it okay? You guys can hear me okay?
Yeah.
It's decent, sorry. It's a pretty good entry point into the agendas that we've been developing within our research group. I talk fast, so maybe that's causing the buzz. Within our research group, which entail a pretty strident critique of the last 100 years or certain streams of the last 100 years of urban research, and a few ideas about how we might think differently about urbanization processes in relation to the Earth. So maybe I'll park it there and see what you all think. It's about 8 minutes, and there's a somewhat eerie soundtrack or sound design with which one of our collaborators on the project is a sound designer. So he contributed in a really interesting way. Okay, here goes. Okay, so,
Thanks, Neil.
yeah.
So that's a really profound and direct way of showing what you're concerned with. Why don't you just tell us a little bit more about the kinds of spaces you're looking at now, the kinds of forms and networks that you think we should be looking at that come under the title of planetary urbanization? What sort of things should we be looking for, along with, you've laid out a whole bunch of different phenomena in the video there. How should we be looking to understand new spaces of urbanization? What's at stake in doing that?
Yeah, so for me the stakes are high, and let me just maybe bring into focus a few of the key agendas that underpin what you just saw. So it's a strong, some might say polemical critique against certain traditions of urban studies, but it's also a plea for a different urban studies that has a much broader and more relational understanding of its object of analysis and of its focus. So let me explain. So there are many students in the room who may be a bit familiar with the field of urban studies, and there are many students in the room who may be deeply immersed in the worlds of urban studies. I'm going to make some broad generalizations. I'm sure Sandy is going to push back, and that's part of why we're here, but just to sort of frame the conversation. So I would make the following generalizations about the very complex, variegated terrains of urban social science and urban studies more generally during the last century. In general, and again, the exceptions to these generalizations are quite interesting. I'm not denying that they're exceptions, but I still think I'm prepared to defend these generalizations. Number one, the urban and urbanization have been almost universally defined as city growth. Urbanization, simply by definition, within urban Marxism, within the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, within urban design discourse, within important streams of urban history and urban demography, etc., the growth of cities. So it's called urbanization, but it basically means cityization. So that could refer to a particular city, let's say New York City, expanding in population size and expanding in area. It can also refer, very importantly to this discussion, to an entire system in which many cities are growing, both in size and in population. But the reference point is basically what I've elsewhere called pointillist. So like you're familiar with, many of you, with pointillist painting, where very elaborate representations are made of light and landscape and people using collections of points. The dominant shape through which the entire world is depicted is circles. So this is essentially the cartographic and analytic lens of so much of urban studies. It's not that everyone is just focusing on individual cities, but that the broader systems of which cities are a part are understood as collections, assemblages, we might say, of points. And urbanization is literally the growth of those points in population and in size, and the proliferation of those points. So the question that I've been trying to pose with my colleagues in this line of work on planetary urbanization is basically, what are the preconditions and what are the consequences, socially, politically, and environmentally, of those points, of the proliferation of the points? So I'm not denying, we are not denying, that urbanization has an intrinsic relationship to cities. And we're not denying that cities exist. And some colleagues in this debate have interpreted our work as somehow claiming that the city, there are many streams of urban studies that claim that the city is superseded and that we live in a post-city or post-metropolitan age. That's not what we're arguing. We think that agglomeration or city building is central to the urbanization process, and it's central to the historical geographies of modern capitalism, and not only of modern capitalism. But the question that I want to pose, and which to some degree I think this video very starkly poses, is does that process, the production of points, the production of agglomerations, exhaust the phenomenon? And my argument is actually not only no, but that if we focus only on those dots, on those points, on those moments of concentration or agglomeration, we fundamentally understand the phenomenon. Because the moment of agglomeration, as we've elsewhere called it, the moment of concentrated urbanization, is fundamentally premised upon and in turn contributes to many transformations outside the city, which is what we're trying to map out in the video. So the preconditions and the consequences. So primary commodity production, food, materials, energy, logistics, all the circulatory processes and infrastructures that facilitate the transport of those elements into the city, and then equally important, in metabolic terms, the consumption and production processes that occur within large agglomerations have massive metabolic consequences, namely waste, into all aspects of the world's environment: water, soil, land, air, obviously carbon into the atmosphere. And the proposition at hand, which again has provoked a lot of debate and hopefully will continue to, because I think it's worth debating, is that in order to understand urbanization, we need to think about all of these preconditions and consequences, which are themselves constantly churning and being transformed, as intrinsic, not as secondary dimensions of urbanization. And maybe we can talk more about it as we get into the conversation, but I'm very concerned about the ways in which ignoring or rendering secondary those preconditions and consequences seriously occludes, limits our ability to understand agglomerations themselves. So in terms of your question, Sandy, just to get us started, I'm not suggesting that urbanists should ignore cities and focus on agrarian studies, although I'm really interested in agrarian studies. And I'm not suggesting that urbanists should ignore cities and start studying extraction and energy, the sort of extraction of various forms of fuel and materials that then get assembled in the city, although I'm also deeply interested in those literatures. What I'm interested in is the relational connections between processes, for example, of extraction and agrarian relations, agrarian environments, agrarian transformations, and urbanization. So in a lot of the work I'm doing, I'm trying to dialogue as an urbanist with colleagues who have deep expertise in agrarian studies, in studies of extraction, in studies of waste landscapes, to try to make the connections. So it's an argument for a new approach to urban studies that tries to, instead of demarcating a specific domain, the city, the urban, that has its own unique qualities and properties as a settlement type, which is what I would argue much of the last 20th century of much of the last century of urban studies has done. Instead of doing that, we need to think of the city and the urban in a radically relational way.
So it seems like there's one of the most sort of powerful things about doing this is it, I think, provokes a series of paradoxes. And you've already sort of alluded to some of those and kind of tried to fend off some of those paradoxes. But let's just go a little deeper into at least two of them, or two ways of seeing them. And I guess one of them has to do with questions of urbanization, and then one of them has to do with the city itself, right? This thing that still exists in this scheme, but is kind of receding to the background. So let me start with urbanization, right? So on the one hand, what we're talking about here is urban studies moving beyond seeing urbanization just as the growth of cities, as you said, the pointillist map, right? No longer bounded entities, right? So we need to see these processes, these planetary impacts, right? The operational landscapes, I think you've called them in other situations, right? So one of the most powerful things that your books and some of your other talks on this are able to do, and people can see this online, I think, is to show us these new kinds of landscapes, which to our eyes look like the transformations of essentially rural places, or using the jargon, hinterland places. But that to say that, no, these are fundamentally now, in some sense, urban places too. And so cities can now only be understood, as you say, in a relational reference to these expansive, explosive processes of planetary urbanization. So I guess one reaction here, and this is sort of focused on thinking about how do we continue to justify thinking about cities, right? One reaction could be, okay, great, this is really good. When we do urban studies, we're actually doing all this other really big, globe-defining, planetary stuff. we're actually thinking at the limits of what we need to be thinking about, right? And this is good for urbanists because, especially here at Brown, I think, we often struggle to justify our work in the context of other kind of work that is self-consciously imagining itself at these larger frames, right? So one thing that those of you who might come to this discussion already thinking is, and looking at these images, which many of you will be familiar with or familiar with the like of us having seen them before, is why is this not just the study of globalization?
Yeah.
Why is this not just the study of late capitalism, right? The political economy of a late stage capital formation and accumulation as it sort of devours the earth, right? We have a story of that from the study of many other disciplines, right? What about this? What about processes of urbanization remain crucial here?
Yeah.
Why should students who research international development or flows of global capital or the environmental effects of global capitalism think about this as a particularly urban question?
Yep. So great question. So the problem for me, I come out of also critical geography among other fields, and the spatialities of international political economy, the spatialities of globalization, the spatialities of capitalism, I would argue cannot be taken for granted. So if we were in a conversation with colleagues in mainstream political science, probably I would be arguing with them for presupposing a kind of methodologically nationalist frame in which the world economy is simply composed of nation states. I was just talking to Mark Blythe before the panel today about the ways in which national economies are themselves easily disaggregated into metropolitan and regional and local economies. I completely agree with that point. And similarly, in relation to almost any other stream of work on political economy of globalization, assumptions about the spatialities of those processes need to be critically interrogated. So to Sandy's question, the claim is fundamentally about the forms and patterns and pathways of what Marxist geographers and others call uneven spatial development under capitalism. And the argument I would make is this: uneven spatial development under capitalism is not naturally configured within any pre-existent unit, be it the city, the region, the metropolis, the nation state, the super region or otherwise, but rather, as Neil Smith, David Harvey, and many others have argued, the units of analysis, the kind of composition of political economic life is constantly being composed and recomposed in and through socio-political struggle. And it changes over time. So instead of just assuming we live in a global economy and there are nation states, and then you look at their interactions over time, we actually have to look at spatialization processes. So space as something that dynamically changes in and through the process of capitalist development, which brings us back to urbanization. I agree with David Harvey and many other urban scholars who insist that the moment of agglomeration, the clustering together of labor, infrastructure, investment, material, energy in space is a constitutive moment of capitalist development. So we can talk about the city or the metropolitan region, but what I'm interested in is the process, the processes through which that moment of concentration unfolds. Questions have to be posed about those processes. They may change over time, their causal sources may change over time, and their consequences may change over time. But I think it's historically quite plausible to argue that throughout the history of capitalism, a moment of concentration, of investment, of population, of infrastructure, of material, and of energy has occurred. Step one. Step two, we go back to the preconditions and consequences. So if uneven spatial development under capitalism has historically involved wave after wave of agglomeration during successive regimes of accumulation, as Marxist geographers call them, systemic cycles of accumulation, as Giovanni Arrighi and others would call them, we have to ask if all of those processes are manifested in the formation and continuing restructuring of large metropolitan areas, what kinds of preconditions and consequences are associated with that? And this takes us precisely to not only the operational landscapes, but to what Naomi Klein calls the sacrifice zones. Let me just quickly explain. The operational landscapes for us are basically zones of production, as illustrated in the video, of primary commodities, so agricultural products, material, fuel, and so forth, that support the big metropolitan concentrations. So one of the quotes that we put up there from William Rees argues that cities are metabolic black holes. So instead of viewing cities the way they often are in kind of triumphalist urban discourse as spikes of GDP, you may have noticed we inverted them in the video, which is a pretty, for folks who work in this field, that's a pretty disorienting move, and it was intended that way. And my colleagues, as you saw, are like pretty amazing visual designers and artists, so they can actually do that with the data.
Yeah, I feel like you're getting a lot of joy out of the gloomy doom aspects of that video.
Yeah, I mean, one of my colleagues at U Chicago claims repeatedly every time I see her that I'm an anti-urbanist. And maybe we can talk about this. And what I always say,
I was going to sidle up to that idea.
We can work our way back to it, but I'll give the punchline away. I'm against capitalist urbanization, 100%. But I'm not against urbanization. We may want to talk about that. But anyway, so the operational landscapes of supply, basically the supply zones, are represented as extrusions, and the cities are represented as intrusions. It's a total inversion of the standard narrative. The sacrifice zones, just a sentence on that. So the idea is that, so the sacrifice zones didn't show up in this video at all. And it's actually a serious problem with, like, how do we quantitatively measure the various forms of waste, including carbon, that are emitted by cities and by metropolitan areas. There's a huge literature on it, but it's extremely problematic. We really don't have a very clear way yet, in my understanding, to actually connect up carbon emissions to specific cities. And although it's a very interesting challenge. But it's simply to say that, like, the intensification, the proliferation, and the spatial extension of what some environmental scientists call dead zones in the biosphere, in the oceans, and on land, we would argue is directly connected to the forward motion of capitalist urbanization. So that for us, you can't separate the proliferation of the points, the proliferation of the spikes, from the carbon in the atmosphere, from the degradation of large swaths of the erstwhile hinterland. Let's use the word hinterland, but let's put it in quotation marks, because I would argue it's really a concept that makes most sense maybe in mercantile capitalism, maybe in early industrial capitalism, but for reasons that maybe we can go into, I think it's, superseded in the Hegelian sense of aufgehoben. It's both preserved and transformed during the forward motion of late 19th century or even mid-19th century fossil capitalist industrialization. That's a longer argument for another day, perhaps, but I'll put it out there.
Yeah, let's stick a little bit with this question about urbanization, or about the city. The second part of that, right, is so why, you have colleagues and friends, people you trust, and who you look to as interlocutors, whose initial thought when they see this is, yeah, this feels strangely anti-urban, right? It feels, right, not only the soundtrack, but also the sense of thinking of cities as black holes, as sites of plunder, right? This neatly reverses, powerfully reverses something that I was suggesting earlier, right? Which is this sense that cities are, in some sense, going to be the way that we get through, at least, or at least we survive potentially survive the coming catastrophes that we're facing as a global, a planet, as a global society, whether we can call it that or not. And so it totally reverses that, right?
Yeah.
You can imagine why that leaves people feeling a little bit hopeless, right? We'd spent a lot of time thinking that it was density, concentration, right, that would lead to new kinds of ways of living, or if we could just convince everyone to live that way, right, we might slightly weather the storm better than if we didn't, right? So the facetious way would be like, all right, what does the Urban Theory Lab really want us everyone to do, right? The answer is clearly not more suburbanization, everybody to live a rural life. We can't embrace the old political culture of the single-family home, right? We have to figure out a way through the capitalist urbanization that we don't like, and doesn't that mean another different form of urbanization?
Yeah, so exactly. So there's a lot there, and let me try to unravel a few threads. So have people in the room, just first of all with a concrete example that takes us pretty far, actually. Have people in the room heard of Masdar? Anyone? So Masdar is a experiment in green design, we might say, in Abu Dhabi. And it was funded through that government with some very important architects, including Norman Foster and others, designing a kind of eco-city. There's a lot of eco-cities now in the world. It's a whole genre of urbanism where everything is basically recycled, renewable materials, zero imprint, zero footprint, and so forth. And so when I discuss this issue with my students, I start with some images of Masdar and the kind of promotional, it's been around for a while, but some of the promotional literature that's used to celebrate green design. Highly energy efficient, very mindful of material choices and recycling of water and so forth. And then if you scale out and look at where Masdar is, in Abu Dhabi, in the Middle East, and you bring into your map, you bring into your visualization, the massive infrastructures of fossil capital that literally surround and swarm this little eco-enclave. No disrespect to the eco-designers who put a lot of creative energy into it, because that's actually very important to the puzzle and maybe to the solution. But there's a serious problem here, because once you look at that bigger geography, which also includes any number of political governance issue, concessionary zones, in which transnational corporations are given exclusive rights to drill oil and export it all through that area. To me, this exactly encapsulates the problem. So much of urban ecological imaginations are locked into the idea that you can design your way forward to a solution through at the scale of the enclave or at the scale of the building. So you put in certain kinds of lights, you retrofit, and I'm not against that. I think that's all very important, although there are important questions to be posed about what is the environmental impact of stuff that claims to be green. And actually, those are very important questions to ask, and when you do, you actually find your way back to a lot of operational landscapes, which are very destructive. But the problem is that if you limit yourself to that scale, you're effectively, I would argue, to put it maybe somewhat polemically, but I'm willing to back this up with more arguments, you're embracing a certain kind of eco-apartheid, in which cities become enclaves, as some British geographers called them some years ago, premium ecological enclaves. So high technology investment in ecological resilience, different kinds of infrastructure that claims to be green, and the rest of the planet, the rest of the biosphere, the rest of the ecosystem of the planet, and the populations whose life worlds have been degraded and transformed for centuries related to the process of capitalist development are simply excluded from those particular enclaves. So to me, it's a really grim situation if urban studies focuses simply at the local scale, because even though there's obviously a lot of progressive energy, a lot of creative energy behind those localist visions, localism is a trap. And this puts on the agenda for me fundamentally, which I think also needs to be on the agenda of urban studies, of repair. If urban studies simply focuses on the local and maybe repairing the damage, the environmental damage and the social violence of capitalist urbanization within the city, it completely brackets the ways in which the development of the city historically is premised upon all kinds of relations to non-city spaces near and far that also need to be repaired. Again, both in social, political terms. We can talk about climate reparations, a very important topic these days, and historically, and environmentally. And I just think that urban studies, sometimes, again, like forgive me if this sounds a little harsh on my own field, but it's sometimes a little too self-satisfied with its demarcation of boundaries around the problem of the city, bracketing just in some ways the most fundamental aspects of the problem. So all of which is to say that, so the Urban Theory Lab doesn't have a design solution or a political solution to these problems, but certainly we're interested in contributing to bringing the problems into focus along with many others in a way that helps us confront the root or the roots in the plural of some of these problems. So any strategy of energy transition, environmental justice, urban ecological transformation for us, well, I'll just say for me, because I'm really just speaking for myself, would have to involve reimagining not simply city design and city form, but the relationship between cities and the earth. And if we don't do that, then I actually think we're not really confronting the problem adequately. But one other sort of subsidiary point to that, also responding to another one of the points that you raised, Sandy, this is not to suggest that we all should somehow only focus on the planetary scale. Like that video was very planetary as a provocation, and also because we were dealing with planetary, worldwide data sets. We can focus on, if we have a relational understanding of space and metabolism, we can keep in view the relationship between cities and the earth, to put it that way, by looking at, water or energy at a very local scale, and then tracking it out. And eventually that takes us to all kinds of relationships to the broader web of life. But it's the nature of the web of life that everything is connected. So that doesn't require any particular scale of intervention. It also depends on what your questions are. I think that it's extremely productive, although also challenging and disorienting, to keep the planetary in view as a horizon, both politically and intellectually. But that's not to say that we simply have to fetishize the planetary or the worldwide scale, the scale of the Earth, the way that maybe some traditions fetishize the nation state or fetishize the local. Like the whole argument is we need a multi-scalar approach. We need to think about space and scale dynamically and relationally, and we have to articulate the research object, the so-called unit of analysis, to the particular question that we're posing, instead of just assuming that there's a pre-given unit of analysis, the city, the region, the nation state, or otherwise.
So I'm mindful of time. We have about a little over half an hour left, and I'll ask one last question and then throw it open to questions at large. So let's try to think a little bit precisely relationally here, to keep the old city, the old bounded entity in the picture and in relation to this larger field of planetary urbanization. One of the things that I think perhaps draws a lot of students and a lot of thinkers to urban studies, to thinking about cities from whatever perspective they draw it from, is to think about social difference, right? To think about problems of inequality based around social difference, and to articulate those in relation to many other kinds of problems, right? So one problem which you've heard many times, I'm sure, about thinking at the planetary scale, right, is its potential universalism, right? Its sense that while you are calling out, or I'm going to avoid that terminology, while you are revealing the way that urban studies perhaps has obscured the larger scale of these networks and these larger processes and landscapes, by zooming out, right, to see them, you also perhaps are obscuring or potentially obscuring the things that happen at this much smaller scale that we spend a lot of time thinking about in urban studies and related disciplines, right? So how do we think relationally about the complex interconnected workings of division, right? Class, race, gender, sexuality, other forms of hierarchy that capitalism has perpetuated or reshaped across its long history, and that urban life has often sort of thrown into relief for us to understand in very precise and very focused terms. Many urbanists and students, as I suggested, have sort of studied the city because it gives us a way to do exactly that. How have you thought about that issue and thought about how do you make that relational move right there in that circuit?
Yeah, no, fundamental point, fundamental question, and a few kind of methodological reflections, but they're also really deeply political. I mean, for me, the planetary is, as all other scales, it's a scale of contradiction and struggle and contradiction and crisis. Contradiction, struggle, and crisis, sorry. And it's not a scale of homogeneity. It's process all the way down. And in the same way that I would reject a kind of either-or choice between the planetary and the local. Like all the scales, again, it depends on what your question is, but they're all intermeshed within historical sociospatial process. So I think there's a lot of confusion in the literatures. For students who may not be immersed yet in these literatures, reading around these literatures, there's just a lot of different constructions of what these concepts mean, and we're making some broad generalizations about some debates. But I guess my plea would be, don't take for granted the claim that the local is self-enclosed and discrete and self-forming. Because I think, you know, the tradition that at least I and my group and lots of others are working suggests, well, it's whatever we experience as local, whatever we construct as local, is relationally constituted. And understanding how it's relationally constituted requires analytic work. In other words, there's no single answer to how that works. You actually have to do the analytic work to reveal it. And doing that analytic work actually starts to help you understand processes. I would say the same processes that we care about. I would say the same thing about the planetary. So the planetary, and it may look otherwise from some of these images where you see this again and again, the sphere. They're data spheres, actually. So they're spheres constructed of data. But for us, the planetary is not simply a pre-given level, like the ultimate horizon of anything. It's literally constituted through a very complex and very, very long intermeshing of processes that are related to, you know, biogeophysical transformations and, in relatively more recent times, human social transformations, what some scholars like Jason Moore call the Capitalocene, which involves, you know, the ways in which modern capitalism has fundamentally transformed certain key aspects of the Earth system. So the concept of the planetary in and of itself doesn't really do any analytic work. You have to use the concept in order to then dig into particular questions about capitalism, about environment, about urbanization that we care about. In terms of the other parts of your question, Sandy, about difference, I mean, what I would argue is basically that the planetary in, you know, the modern capitalist epoch is fully intermeshed with, you know, the history of racial empire, colonialism, and capitalist destruction, and capitalist transformation more generally. So that in looking at the planetary scale, you actually gain some capacity to understand the interconnected processes of racial dispossession that are intrinsically connected to the development of capitalism, albeit always occurring within contextually specific forms, but embedded within a broader, what some scholars call a kind of racial empire of capitalism. So I think those are productive starting points, but deploying those general starting points in inquiry requires more concrete, complex modes of investigation than we've attempted to do here. But I do think that urban studies, the future of urban studies, the urban studies that at least some of us want to build, will be better equipped to understand some of the key issues that we've traditionally understood to be urban if we bring the planetary dimension or horizon more directly into our analysis than it has historically been the case. Although, again, there are some interesting exceptions in the last 100 years and more of urban studies, of urbanists who focus on cities, but who also have a pretty strong interest in the Earth and in the planetary. And if people are interested, we can go into some of those traditions. I still assign that stuff, and probably others do as well.
Great. Well, let's see what people are interested in. Let's throw it open to questions. And please, we'd like to open the floor first to undergraduate and other students who are here first. That would be great. Who has questions? I think we have mics at the side of the room, and so if you have a question, it's probably best to head over there, to one of the sides there.
I think I see a hand.
Great, I see someone headed that way. Go ahead and head over there and go ahead first. Yeah, go ahead.
So you spoke a little bit earlier about Masla, and I grew up in the UAE, so
Oh, wow.
I heard a lot about it growing up. Every year they would make us sit in classes where we sort of learned about it. And the sort of criticisms of Masla are sort of things that I've also thought about, how we have this 16-lane highway cutting our cities in half, and then they say, but this one patch. But I'm also curious to know what you think the future of these sort of green cities, like, and taking into account the greenwashing aspect of it. Saudi Arabia recently announced the line.
Yep.
They plan of 9 million people, and I think that it has a lot in common with Mustard.
Does.
But I just want to know what you think those sorts of projects will pave for the future of sustainable cities.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. So I spent 10 years teaching in a design school, so I'm really, I have a ambivalent relationship to the design disciplines, as my friends and colleagues over here know, having also worked in that world. And it's hard to generalize, but let me do so anyway. So on the one hand, the world of design, the worlds of design are filled with creative and radical energies. To imagine possible urban worlds, as David Harvey put it, alternative urbanizations. And that's essential to our collective struggle to forge a different future. So in that sense, design, not just the disciplines, but the project of just designing, engineering, thinking creatively about other ways of organizing our basic systems of life and collectivity, it's absolutely essential. And in that sense, be it Masdar, be it a green so-called green skyscraper, or any other experiment that starts with a very specific site, I'm completely fascinated and thrilled to support that. And to some degree, that's also what Masdar was and maybe still is. You have to start at some scale. You could start at the planetary scale, but redesigning the entire planet, people have tried, come up with models, back in the 50s and 60s and earlier, Buckminster Fuller and others, like a planetary design. But that generates other kinds of problems. So the critique, just to be clear, is not that the effort to, whether it's redesigning a light bulb or redesigning the materials that we use in our everyday lives, or redesigning our relationship to water in our everyday lives at a particular scale is somehow problematic or reactionary. Of course not. And this is one of the really creative and imaginative capacities that architects and landscape designers and others really bring to our work. The problem from my point of view is that politically, when those sorts of experiments get demarcated at a local scale without any systematic discussion about the politics and the kind of infrastructural complexity, the land use complexity, and above all, the social complexities of scaling it up, it actually becomes a form of, to use another term from David Harvey, or it may become a form of militant particularism, where you're demarcating a particular enclave, in this case of green design or energy efficiency or whatever, without actually thinking about the broader context. In fact, not just without thinking about the broader context, but almost with explicit blindness to it. And then those particular models become celebrated, they get replicated, they get circulated around, and it leads many decision makers in many parts of the world to view those templates, those prototypes, as solutions. And it creates a kind of almost ideological dream world in which we think that we are actually solving the deep crises of our planet through creating these enclaves, when in fact what we're really doing is black boxing those crises and creating quasi or putatively safe enclaves for the privileged. And there's a wonderful essay some years ago in New Left Review by Mike Davis, one of the really most brilliant thinkers in this field that I think for many generations. And it's called Who Will Something the Ark? Who will build the Ark? Question mark. And it's an absolutely brilliant essay because it's a reflection on exactly this contradiction. And the first part of the essay basically tries to imagine a progressive scenario in which cities really become the ark of a future ecological and socially just civilization. Actually, that's the second part of the essay. Sorry. The first part of the essay is basically in the spirit of a lot of the things I've been saying, which is just a critique of all of the kind of blind spots and naive and problematic assumptions associated with such a proposition because of the much larger scale on which they occur. And what Mike Davis did in that wonderful essay is he basically constructed two arguments that completely negate one another. intentionally. It's actually a pretty humorous essay in some ways because he frames it around a movie. I can't remember which, but it's a movie from the 50s where somebody is on trial for a crime, and that person also serves as his own lawyer in the trial. So there are all these scenes in the courtroom where he's got to both be the lawyer and the defendant. And that's kind of the contradiction. In other words, that's, I think, what Mike Davis was saying in the essay, that on some level we have to try to build the arc at whatever scale. Maybe it's not the city, maybe it's a bigger territory, which to some degree is what a lot of the debates about the Green New Deal have been about. But at the same time, we have to have the, the kind of critical lens on the blind spots and limitations of those. So it's a little bit like this old famous phrase from Antonio Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. It's an essay. Mike Davis's essay is a little bit in that spirit as well. The arc is kind of the optimism of the will, but he can't help it. Pessimism of intellect, that's also what we need to learn in programs like this. Unfortunately, well, for better or for worse, given the world we live in, we have to learn it.
Anybody else? Please make your way to the mic. Yeah, thanks.
So, I mean, you were kind of talking about how you don't think that that urbanization is not necessarily like the best and most sustainable way for humans to live. But I think we can all agree that, suburban sprawl is not the best. But in a world of 8 billion people, do you think everyone living in rural areas is more sustainable than living in cities? And is there a good scientific way to measure sustainability of where you live? Because, I live in New York. I know I have to say that in every conversation, but I feel very sustainable. I feel like when I heat my apartment, I'm also heating the apartments above and below me, and riding the subway is so much more preferable to, driving everywhere.
Yeah.
So.
Great. No, thank you so much. Those are very, very important questions. So let's start with New York, and then we'll scale out. So there's a wonderful series of essays by a friend and former PhD student of mine, Daniel Aldana Cohen, who's reflecting on this puzzle exactly with regard to New York. And the point he makes is that it kind of depends, even in New York. So if you're looking at, let's just say, the Upper East Side, you could say all those things about density in terms of economies of scale and heating and so forth, and it's better than suburban sprawl. But then if you actually look at the carbon footprint, just to stay with carbon, of a lot of people who live on the Upper East Side, they fly a lot, they might engage in certain forms of luxury consumption. So if you compare their environmental footprint or imprint to, let's say, New Yorkers who might live in a working class neighborhood in a public housing project, we're dealing with completely different formations of density. That's an argument Daniel Aldana Cohen has made at length, so I won't go into the details, but it's just an invitation to think, to really sociologically unpack something like density. And the argument I would make, completely in accord with Daniel's work, is, urban form, spatial form is really important, but unless we connect it to the broader metabolic processes that are connected to urban form, it's just like a spatial fetishism. In other words, maybe it's the case in some circumstances that certain forms of density, depending on lots of other contingent factors, will be a more environmentally sane way to live. But actually, another point about New York, even if you have the massive density of New York, if that massive density is directly supported by coal or by oil instead of by some other green technology, some questions can be posed about that form of density. And much of the urbanization in the modern world of the last 150 years is basically fossil fueled. So I would insert that observation centrally into any discussion about urban form and to any discussion about suburban form. So similarly, so to bring suburbanization in, which was part of your question, very appropriate, we've got to ask the same questions of decentralized or suburban forms of settlement. If they're fossil fueled, just to stay with energy, then there are some big problems, maybe even bigger problems. If they're fueled by wind or by solar or by another renewable technology, then we might have a different comparison on our hands. So all of which is to say that I'm not opposed to the fundamental question of, I'm not opposed to exploring the fundamental question of different spatial arrangements and whether some spatial arrangements might be more or less environmentally sound. But I would argue that that question only makes sense if we bring in a lot more content to the question of the spatial form, related to energy, related to food, related to other forms of consumption, related to the full social metabolism of life. And at some point with any account of urbanization, whether it's a capitalist form of urbanization or some other form of urbanization, whether prior to capitalism or hopefully after capitalism, we're basically thinking about the relationship between where human beings live and reproduce themselves and all of the other spaces that support that system of life or that are transformed through that system of life. For me, that's the fundamental metabolic dimension of urbanization. Or to put it yet another way, for me at core, whether we're talking about capitalist cities or any other form of cities, the metabolic or environmental essence of cities, I'm going to make an essentialist statement with full embracing of that. The metabolic essence or environmental essence of cities is that they externalize key aspects of their metabolism. In other words, their food, their water, maybe, their energy supplies, and their materials. Once that externalization, or if that externalization is no longer happening, we might ask whether it's even urbanization. So in other words, if you have a settlement space that's completely autarkic, where people are farming their own food and doing everything internally, I think we probably need a different label. I think that the concept of the city at core, both historically, like going back into archaeological modes of inquiry, all the way up to envisioning some post-capitalist city or post-capitalist urbanization, it still involves trying to understand or imagine the relationship, again, between where human beings live and reproduce themselves and how they source basically what they need in order to do that and the consequences of that. So that's a spatial and environmental relationship. And to me, that's the metabolic puzzle of urbanization. And the way that that problem is resolved, although I don't think it's resolved at all under capitalism, is basically through plunder, among much else. It's through basically degrading the biogeophysical preconditions of the city's very existence, successively over the centuries. And that's not a very good model on which to base our, any kind of environmental future. It looks like you have a follow-up, though. I'm just.
Well, I just feel like there's 8 billion people in the world, and we're not all going to survive with vegetable gardens. You know what I mean? Like, there's just not enough arable land for that. The fact remains that we are, under a capitalist system. We do live in cities. We all want our microwaves and our Netflix and our power. With the 8 billion people the number's still growing. It's not going down until
Yeah.
What's the best solution for them? Like, should people be moving to cities, or should I go buy a farm in Kansas?
Yeah.
I think it could eventually be in Kansas, but then.
Yeah, no, great question. So there's a lot to be said about this question, but let me just put down some clues because it actually requires some disaggregation of a few elements. So the whole question of agriculture and how to feed 8 billion people is a pretty complicated and contentious one within agrarian studies, and within left agrarian studies as well. There's an ongoing debate right now among advocates of degrowth and advocates of what's sometimes called eco-modernization, which is exactly on this question of whether a viable future would involve, on the one side, continuing to industrialize agriculture, but reconfiguring the relations of production towards some sort of post-capitalist and post-fossil fueled formation. So an important scholar, very interesting scholar, who's advocating a version of that argument, I'm simplifying a little bit, is Matt Huber, Huber, which I recommend looking at his work. There's also a counterposition, broadly understood as degrowth or agroecological, which argues that actually we can have a much more healthy and effective, both socially and environmentally, food system if we stop fetishizing industrialization and we think about a variety of different ways of organizing land and land use and the relationship between settlements or cities and the rest of the world. in order to address this problem. So we have to develop tools for thinking about this very fundamental question, but in a way that avoids just thinking about cities as kind of a homogeneous, whatever that is, and industrialization and land use. There are just any number of existing models in the world that are actually incredibly diverse, which generate different responses to that particular question. So the choices that we have, in short, are not simply urbanization, everybody lives in cities, suburbanization, it's decentralized. City, even if we decide, or whoever we is also a pretty important question here, but even if social and political collectivities were to opt for a more centralized or concentrated form of settlement, that can also take a variety of different forms in terms of design, and it can also involve a variety of different relationships to the supply zones, food, material, and energy. And these are exactly the kinds of questions that I think we need to be debating within the field of urban studies.
How can we address these global processes systematically when the globe right now is so nationalized?
Yeah. I kind of want Timmons Roberts in the back to help us with that particular question, but I don't know if I have the expertise, but it's a fundamental problem. The governance side of this puzzle is a mess, and it's absolutely urgent. And this, in a certain way, takes us to questions about pedagogy and the disciplinary division of labor. Sandy and I were talking about this earlier today. So many environmental studies programs in this country and beyond are really heavily focused on environmental science. And environmental science is fundamental to all the kinds of things that we're discussing. But this is exactly the question that you just posed, is a very clear argument for why we need social scientists, political sociologists in the room to help us critically think about the severe limits of the governance system that we currently have for dealing with, or as it were, not dealing with, the proliferating climate emergencies of our time. And in a certain way, this also circles us back to some of the earlier discussions about design and the local. So the local, whether it's in Masdar or in any city or any neighborhood in the world, it's not only a site for experimentation around technologies, let's say of energy efficient architecture or something like that. Very importantly, and probably this should have been brought in a lot earlier in my own remarks, so I'm really grateful to you for raising the question now. Very importantly, the local, the city, the neighborhood is a central site for experimentation with democratic governance and other forms of governance around environmental justice and, we could say energy transitions. Like that's actually absolutely essential for us to think about, also in relation to the question of whether we can scale it. In other words, if we develop some sort of municipally controlled, and there are many examples of this in the world, public utilities that commits itself to decarbonization. And you can do that at a neighborhood, you can do that at a building scale, like in a co-op, or you put a solar panel on your roof. You can do that at a neighborhood scale, and there are lots of examples of that. Can you scale it out to the city? Can you scale it out to the region? Can you scale it out to the state or the territory? Those are openings. I don't think that's the whole story. There are lots of other scales. But those are very important. And there's a lot of municipal, environmental, radical struggle going on around the world precisely in pursuit of that project. And that's a relevant flank, it seems to me, a very relevant flank or stream in the struggle to supersede the kind of fossil capitalist disaster that, that we live under and that we've been living through for quite some time. That still begs the question of whether, of how to deal with the kind of severe limitations in the international governance system of climate. I mean, we see, sort of cycle after cycle of limited or failed reforms, and so forth. And that's extremely depressing. But international governance is absolutely essential to any possible future. And that also crystallizes a lot of the uneven development and spatial inequalities that we've also been talking about, because they get fought out precisely through these negotiations over climate governance.
other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to talk a little bit more about non-capitalist urbanization. You've talked a lot about capitalist urbanization. I was just particularly interested in learning more about what attributes might be common to non-capitalist urbanization forms, and specifically how those attributes might make an urban area regenerative rather than extractive.
Yeah, thank you very much. In a certain way, you, with the latter part of your comment, I think already hit the nail on the head of regenerative rather than extractive. I mean, at core, capitalism is based on production for profit and the continual reinvestment of that profit in pursuit of more profit. I mean, for those of you who have already read Marx in college, and hopefully everyone will, it's MCM prime. So you start with money, you invest it in production, and at the end of the production cycle, you have the prime, which is more money than you started with, which is profit. And capital accumulation is the endless replication of that cycle, indeed on a planetary scale. And the environmental consequences of that are plain to see all around us, unevenly developed. So the whole literature on circular metabolism, which goes back a long time and remains, I would argue, as relevant today as now, in some ways contains certain seeds of a fairly radical critique of capitalism, because capitalism is a kind of linear metabolism. It's endless compound growth, and the externalization of the consequences of that growth onto human bodies, often racialized, and the biosphere. And so a circular metabolism brings in questions about repair and regeneration and reproduction. So these are very important themes. Again, I would strongly urge for those interested in this, not only engagement with the environmental studies literature on circular metabolism, but also, for example, feminist and feminist Marxist literatures on social reproduction theory are very much about this, because the claim in that literature is that the linear metabolism of capital, the wage nexus, is fundamentally premised upon all forms, all kinds of different forms of unpaid work, gendered and racialized. And that unpaid work, it may not appear in the actual wage, in the formal wage, but it's literally embedded within the production process. And in a certain way, we've been talking about an environmental dimension of the same thing, which critical Marxist environmental scholars like Jason Moore and others have really been bringing to the fore in their recent work, that capitalism hinges fundamentally on the appropriation of unpaid human and non-human labor. The regenerative capacities of the environment are literally appropriated and also degraded in every cycle of capitalist production. And so we might not know concretely what would a post-capitalist or non-capitalist form of urbanization or form of production look like, but we can hypothesize, at least based on those analytic demarcations from those various literatures, that it would involve different forms of appropriation that don't degrade and demolish and diminish the spaces, the life forms that are themselves involved in the appropriation process. It's a pretty abstract definition, but I think that's actually a useful way of effectively talking about a regenerative or circular metabolic system. Of course, it's always already political. So the point about governance is also relevant. We have to also raise questions about what would the governance model of that particular metabolic circuit look like? Because metabolism, at least within the intellectual universe that we're talking about here, it's always political. It's always politically mediated. It always has collective dimensions. And that's something that we also need to think about.
Yeah, having taught in a design school for so long, I know you already said you're like ambivalent in a way toward the design discipline, but this is such an inherently spatial problem. So I'm wondering like where design has a place in this. Like if, because these things that plague us at this planetary scale end up being so local, like as urbanists, like where's our impact?
Yeah. And again, Damian White is in the back, and I kind of want to give the mic to Damian and hear his thoughts, because Damian teaches in a very important design school down the street from us here. But my 2 cents on the matter would be that, and thank you for that question, you know, the whole history of design in the modern world has been filled with certain kinds of triumphalist agendas that affirm design, different traditions of design as somehow the solution to all the world's problems or certain of the world's problems. But meanwhile, all kinds of subterranean, countercultural, critical traditions that interrogate those triumphalist assumptions and offer alternative visions of what design can and might and maybe should do. And those traditions are extremely robust in design schools all around us, including very, very close by, both in Providence and in the region and beyond. And it's also a generational thing. I mean, for me, one of the most, probably the most wonderful thing, the thing that I enjoyed most and that I learned most from my decade at Harvard GSD was working with younger generations of designers who brought to the school and to the disciplines radical and critical energies. They were committed and are committed to the design disciplines as tools of spatial transformation, as a basis on which to imagine and build collectively alternative worlds. But that also necessarily involved and does involve a strong critique of existing epistemologies and spatial practices. So that internal self-critical or autocritical moment within the design disciplines, it's robust across many generations. But I think it's particularly robust among younger generations who come to design schools and really want to learn design, whether it's architecture, landscape, planning, or otherwise, urban design, as a basis on which to confront social, racial injustice, environmental crises. And they find, at least in some of the disciplines, a lot of blind spots and a lot of approaches that obfuscate or even exacerbate the problems. But these generations, these streams of work persist. In other words, instead of abandoning design, or for that matter, we could say the same thing about economics. Should one abandon economics to mainstream neoclassical economics? Of course not. There's any number of heterodox and radical and critical traditions of economics that give us lots of powerful insights for rethinking the geopolitical economies of capitalism today. And similarly about design. Of course, we need design. It's part of the problem, but it might also well be part of the solution. And so that struggle, these kinds of struggles have to occur within all the different disciplines. As part of the reinvention of those disciplines, the creation of interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary spaces such as this one is actually very important. And maybe that's also something for me just to underscore. It's probably implicit in the conversation, but just again for students in the room, I don't know how many of you have already declared a major, or some of you are thinking about what you're going to major in. But one thing that I've always really appreciated about urban studies programs, my first job was at NYU Metropolitan Studies. I taught in that program for a decade before I moved on, and now I'm in another interdisciplinary program, although I'm also in sociology. These inter and post-disciplinary spaces are really, really important to preserve, to reproduce, and to expand in relation to the kind of intellectual and political challenges and struggles that we're talking about. Also the environmental, the Brown Institute for Environment and Society, I mean, that's another example of that, and Brown has lots of such spaces. And those are really important as a complement, and maybe for some of us as an alternative to disciplinary knowledge formations, precisely because they enable us to think broadly and sometimes much more politically, much more radically than we can within individual disciplines that are kind of locked into their own struggles about the reproduction of the discipline. Like I read lots of environmental sociology, or what classifies itself as environmental sociology, but I would argue, I'd love to hear Tim and your view on this, but I would argue that a lot of the more radical and interesting work in environmental social science, even when it's produced within sociology departments, it's oriented towards a much broader debate. And it's articulated in relation to a much broader interdisciplinary space rather than simply being directed towards some kind of sub-discipline of environmental sociology. Or we could say the same thing about like urban sociology or urban history. Like I'm officially, one of the urban sociologists in my fine sociology department, but the kind of urban sociology that I do is, it's oriented towards sociology, but it's oriented towards a lot of other literatures, maybe too many, you might wonder after a conversation like this.
Great, thank you. So on a day when the city as we've known it has been called into question, I'm going to take that as a win for urban studies from Neil Brenner. Thank you, everybody. I think we need to close out because it has gotten late. But thanks, let's thank Neil for his time.